God. God wills it. This saying sheltered the Crusaders from the questions of Cineas. The conquests of the Christian warriors were not a vain pursuit like those of Pyrrhus if they were willed by God. One does not surpass the will of God. Man meets an absolute end of his efforts in God, because there is nothing outside of him. The necessity of the divine being extends over those actions that end with him, and saves them for eternity. But what does God will? If God is infinity and the plenitude of being, there is in him no distance between his project and his reality. What he wills is. He wills what is. His will is only the immobile foundation of being. One can barely still call it a will. Such a God is not a singular person. He is the universal, the unchangeable and eternal everything, and the universal is silence. He demands nothing. He promises nothing. He requires no sacrifice. He dispenses no punishment or reward. He can justify nothing nor condemn anything. One can found neither optimism nor despair on him. He is. One can say nothing more. The perfection of his being leaves no place for man. To transcend oneself in an object is to found it. But how can one found what already is? Man cannot transcend himself in God if God is completely given. Man is then nothing but an indifferent accident on the surface of being. He is on earth, like the explorer lost in a desert. He can go to the right, to the left. He can go wherever he wants, but he will never go anywhere, and the sand will cover up his tracks. If he wants to give meaning to his behavior, he should not address himself to this impersonal, indifferent, and complete God. His motto would be one proposed on the pediment of the Abbey of Theleme: Do what thou wilt. If God wills all that is, man has only to act however he wants. When one is in God's hands, one need not worry about what one has to do. One has no remorse about what one has done, said the heretical sect of Almericians in the 12th century, and they squandered their lives in joyous orgies. The Church burned the Almericians with great pomp. There exists, however, a Catholic naturalism that extends the benediction of God over the entire earth. We find an echo of this, for example, in Claudel. Everything comes from God, therefore everything is good. Man does not have to turn away from the earth, and he even has a lot of trouble corrupting this original destination within him, because he is a creature of God. It is difficult to do evil, because what is the good. But an orthodox Christian avoids taking such a thought to the extreme. Well, dear ma'am, says the worldly and gourmand priest as he sits down at the table, would God have invented all these good things if he did not want us to eat them? But he is carefully forgetting that God also invented woman. There was an old woman who, outraged, refused to put butter in her soft-boiled egg. I eat it like the dear Lord made it, she said, and she reached for the salt shaker. We shall pray to God with his entire oeuvre. Nothing that he does is in vain. Nothing is foreign to our salvation, cries Claudel. If God's oeuvre is completely good, it is because it is completely useful to the salvation of man. It is therefore not an end in itself, but a means that gets its justification from how we use it. But then, how do we know if the melon was really invented to be eaten with our family? Maybe it was invented to not be eaten. Maybe the goods of this world are good, only because man can refuse them. This is why St. Francis of Assisi smiled at the world, but did not partake of it. For all things you have but praise, says the archaeologist to the Viceroy of Naples in The Satin Slipper by Claudel, but it angers me to see that you use none of it. However, the Viceroy gives away the riches that he does not use, and to give something away is a way of using it. Asceticism is another form of pleasure. Whatever he does, man makes use of earthly goods, because through them he accomplishes his redemption, or his ruin. He must therefore decide how to make use of them. His decision is not written in the object, because any use is surpassing, and the surpassing is not given anywhere. It is not. It has to be. What does it have to be? It has to be in accordance with the will of God, says the Christian. So one renounces all naturalism. Nothing is good except virtue. Evil is sin, and virtue is the submission to divine exigencies. There are, therefore, exigencies in God. He waits for man to destine himself to it. He created man so that there exists a being who is not a given, but who accomplishes his being according to his Creator's desire. The will of God, then, seems like an appeal to man's freedom. It demands something that has to be, that is not yet. It is thus project. It is the transcendence of a being who has to be its being, who is not. So, a relationship between God and man is conceivable. As long as God is not all that he has to be, man can found him. He finds his place in the world. He is in situation with respect to God. And this is how God seems to be in situation with respect to man. This is what the German mystic Angelus Silesius means when he writes, "God needs me as I need him." The Christian then finds himself in front of a personal and living God for whom he can act. But in this case, God is no longer the absolute, the universal. He is that false infinity about which Hegel speaks, who allows the finite facing him to subsist as separate from him. He is for man a neighbor. This definite singular God could satisfy the aspirations of human transcendence. He would indeed be a concrete being, complete and closed in upon himself, because he would exist, and at the same time be indefinitely open, because his existence would be an endless transcendence. He could not be surpassed, because he would himself be a perpetual surpassing. Man could only accompany his transcendence without ever transcending it. When I have accomplished the will of God, a new will grab me. There will never be any after that. But the will of this God is no longer written in things, because it is no longer the will of what is, but of what has to be. It is no longer the will of everything, and man must discover its singular shape. To want the will of God, this entirely formal decision is not sufficient to dictate any actions to man. Does God want the believer to massacre the unfaithful, burn the heretics, or tolerate their faith? Does he want him to go off to war, or to make peace? Does he want capitalism or socialism? What is the temporal and human side of the eternal will? Man claims to transcend himself in God, but he never transcends himself, except in the heart of immanence. He must accomplish his redemption on earth. Which of the earthly undertakings will raise him up to heaven? Let us listen to the voice of God, says the believer. He will tell us himself what he expects of us. But such a hope is naive. God could manifest himself only through an earthly voice, because our ears can hear no other. But how, then, does one recognize its divine nature? Upon asking a hallucinating woman who that interlocutor was, who spoke to her by mysterious waves, she responded cautiously, "He says that he is God, but I don't know him." Moses could have felt the same mistrust about the voice that came out of the burning bush, or that rumbled at the top of Mount Sinai. Whether the voice comes from a cloud, a church, or a confessor's mouth, the transcendent must always manifest himself through an immanent presence in the world. His transcendence will always escape us. Even in my heart, this order I hear is ambiguous. There lies the source of Abraham's anguish, which Kierkegaard describes in Fear and Trembling. Who knows if it's not a question of a temptation of the devil, or my pride? Is it really God who is speaking? Who will distinguish the saint from the heretic? Kafka describes the same uncertainty in The Castle. Man can receive messages, and even see the messenger. But isn't this one an impostor? And does he know who sends him? Hasn't he forgotten half the message along the way? Is the letter that he hands over to me authentic? And what is its meaning? The Messiah says that he is the Messiah. The false Messiah also says it. Who will distinguish one from the other? One will be able to recognize them only by their works. But how will we decide whether these works are good or bad? We will decide in the name of a human good. All morality that claims to justify itself by divine transcendence proceeds this way. It posits a human good and affirms that it is willed by God because it is the good. Claudel asserts that we must prefer order to disorder because order is, while disorder is the negation of being. Because order is in itself superior to disorder, we proclaim that it conforms to God's designs. But Claudel is forgetting that, as Spinoza and Bergson have shown, only man's point of view makes order seem like order. Is Claudel's order the same as God's? There is a bourgeois order, a socialist order, a democratic order, a fascist order, and each one is disorder in the eyes of its adversary. Every society always claims to have God with it. It recreates him in its image. The society speaks, not God. But if I turn toward myself to question myself, I hear only the voice of my own heart. The Catholic Church and the Protestant individualist can rightly reproach each other for taking the echo of their personal convictions as a divine inspiration. I will not meet God himself outside of myself any more than within myself. I will never notice any celestial sign written on the earth. If it is written down, it is earthly. Man cannot enlighten himself through God. Through man one tries to shed light upon God. God's call is always made to be heard through men, and through human undertakings man will respond to this call. God, if he existed, would therefore be powerless to guide human transcendence. Man is never in situation except before men, and this presence, or this absence way up in heaven, does not concern him.